The document sits in the National Archives, stamped with faded red ink. Secret. Declassified only in 1974, decades after it should have been forgotten. Inside are maps, invasion routes, estimated casualty figures, and detailed strategies for the complete military conquest of Canada. This wasn't some paranoid general's fever dream. This was official United States policy. Updated. Refined. Practiced. While Americans stood in breadlines during the Great Depression, the military was planning to invade the neighbor they waved to across the world's longest undefended border. War Plan Red. The name sounds innocuous until you understand what it means. In the early 20th century, the American military developed color-coded war plans for potential conflicts with every major power. War Plan Orange targeted Japan. War Plan Black focused on Germany. War Plan Gold dealt with France. And War Plan Red prepared for war with the British Empire. But within War Plan Red lived something even more specific. War Plan Crimson. The detailed blueprint for conquering Canada. 500,000 troops. 6 to 12 months for complete occupation. Every major city marked for seizure. Halifax. Quebec. Montreal. Winnipeg. Vancouver. All of it mapped out with cold precision. Stand at Niagara Falls today and watch families from both sides taking photos together. Americans and Canadians mixing freely, indistinguishable except for the occasional accent. Children playing in the mist, completely unaware that their great-grandparents' generation was drawing up plans to shoot at each other. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. This is supposed to be the friendliest border on Earth. These are supposed to be the two nations that prove peaceful coexistence is possible. Yet there it is in black and white. Maps with arrows. Troop movements. Strategic objectives. The United States military seriously planning to invade Canada. The initial reaction is to laugh it off. Obviously, this never happened. Obviously, cooler heads prevailed. Obviously, this was some bureaucratic exercise that nobody took seriously. Except the evidence says otherwise. American troops actually conducted training exercises based on Canadian invasion scenarios. The plan wasn't filed away and forgotten. It was updated repeatedly through 1935. Officers studied it. Strategies were refined. This wasn't a joke. This was active military planning for a war with the country that Americans today barely think of as foreign. To understand how this became possible, you have to understand that War Plan Red wasn't America's first attempt to take Canada. It was the fourth. The pattern runs through American history like a dark thread nobody wants to acknowledge. 3 times before, the United States tried to conquer its northern neighbor. 3 times, the attempt failed. And each failure seemed only to reinforce the idea that next time, with better planning, it might work. The first attempt came during the American Revolution itself. 1775. The ink barely dry on the Declaration of Independence. American forces, convinced that Canadians were yearning to throw off British rule, launched an invasion. Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, led a desperate expedition through the Maine wilderness. Winter closed in. Men starved. Smallpox ravaged the ranks. The assault on Quebec City turned into a frozen nightmare. American forces were driven back in defeat, retreating through the snow, leaving their dead behind in a foreign land that wanted nothing to do with their revolution. The assumption had been simple and catastrophically wrong. American leaders believed Canadians, especially the French-speaking population, would welcome liberation from British rule. Join the cause of freedom. Rise up against the crown. Instead, they got ambivalence at best and outright hostility at worst. French Canadians and British loyalists alike rejected the American invasion. The first lesson should have been learned then. Canada wasn't waiting to be rescued. But the lesson didn't stick. 37 years later, the United States tried again. The War of 1812. British ships were impressing American sailors, dragging them off to serve in the Royal Navy. Western expansion was blocked by British-supported Native American resistance. War fever gripped the young nation. And Canada, tied to Britain, became the obvious target. Thomas Jefferson himself declared that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. The confidence was breathtaking. The reality was humiliating. American forces launched a three-pronged invasion. Attack across the Niagara frontier. Drive north from Detroit. Push toward Montreal via Lake Champlain. Each prong failed spectacularly. Detroit surrendered in August 1812 without a serious fight. At the Battle of Queenston Heights, Canadian militia and British regulars threw back the American assault. The invasion stalled, then reversed. American forces did manage to burn York, the settlement that would become Toronto. The British response was to march on Washington and burn the White House. The president's mansion went up in flames in August 1814 while American forces watched helplessly. The war ended in stalemate. No territory changed hands. Second attempt to conquer Canada. Second failure. But the pattern still wasn't done. After the Civil War ended in 1865, a new threat emerged. The Fenian Brotherhood. Irish-American veterans, hardened by years of combat, organized themselves into a private army with a wild plan. Invade Canada. Hold it hostage. Force Britain to withdraw from Ireland. It sounds absurd in retrospect, but these weren't amateurs. These were trained soldiers with weapons and conviction. And they had reason to believe the American government might quietly support them. The Fenian raids began in 1866. Armed men crossed the border at multiple points. The Battle of Ridgeway in June saw Fenian forces briefly victorious against Canadian militia. Newspapers screamed headlines about Irish rebels conquering Canadian territory. More raids followed in Quebec and Manitoba. The American government officially condemned the attacks, but enforcement was selective. Arms flowed north. The message to Canada was clear. You're vulnerable. Your neighbor is dangerous. Even when it's not the American government doing the invading, it might be American citizens with American weapons. The Fenian raids ultimately failed. The U.S. government eventually cracked down. But the damage to Canadian psyche was permanent. Fear of American expansion became foundational to Canadian identity. When the separate British colonies in North America came together to form the Dominion of Canada in 1867, one driving force was the need to present a united front against potential American aggression. Canada became a nation partly to defend itself against the United States. Third attempt at conquest. Third failure. Which brings us back to War Plan Red in 1930. By this point, you'd think the lesson would be clear. Canada can't be conquered. Canada doesn't want to be conquered. Leave it alone. But geopolitics doesn't work on simple lessons. It works on strategic calculations. And in 1930, there were genuine reasons to believe the United States and Britain might go to war. The First World War had ended barely a decade earlier. The aftermath was messy. Britain owed the United States billions in war debt. Economic competition was fierce. Naval rivalry simmered despite arms limitation treaties. Britain's empire, though still vast, was clearly declining. The United States was rising. Imperial trade preferences shut American goods out of lucrative markets. Diplomatic tensions flared repeatedly. Neither side wanted war, but both planned for it. Because that's what professional militaries do. They prepare for scenarios they hope never materialize. Canada's position made it the inevitable first target. Canada wasn't independent. Not fully. Foreign policy was still controlled by London until the Statute of Westminster in 1931. If war broke out between the United States and Britain, Canada would automatically be enemy territory. British naval bases on North American soil. A launching point for attacks on American cities. A source of resources for the British war effort. From a purely strategic standpoint, the logic was inescapable. Fight Britain, fight Canada first. War Plan Red laid it all out. Phase 1, immediate seizure of Halifax. This wasn't optional. Halifax was Britain's primary North American naval base. The port where reinforcements would arrive. Where the Royal Navy would dock. Where supplies would flow to support British operations. Take Halifax, and you cut the transatlantic lifeline. The plan called for naval blockade combined with amphibious assault. Storm the city. Secure the harbor. deny Britain its foothold. Without Halifax, defending Canada from across the ocean became nearly impossible. Phase 2, the drive north through the Quebec corridor. American forces would surge up from Vermont and New York, pushing toward Montreal and Quebec City. The goal wasn't just to capture cities. It was to cut Canada in two. Separate the maritime provinces from the rest of the country. Control the St. Lawrence River, which meant controlling Canadian commerce, transportation, and communication. Montreal was Canada's largest city, its economic heart. Quebec City controlled the narrowing of the river. Take both, and eastern Canada collapses into isolated pockets of resistance. Phase 3, simultaneous western offensives. American troops pouring across the border from North Dakota toward Winnipeg, the gateway to the prairies. Another force driving from Montana into Alberta, targeting resource-rich regions. A third striking from Washington state toward Vancouver, seizing Canada's Pacific Naval Base and cutting off access to the ocean. The strategy was overwhelming force on multiple fronts. Don't give Canada time to organize. Don't allow Britain to send reinforcements. Blitzkrieg before the term existed. Estimated timeline for complete conquest, 3 to 6 months. After that, military occupation. Install an American administration. Absorb the territory or hold it as leverage in negotiations with Britain. On paper, it looked achievable. Canada's military was tiny. Its population was a fraction of America's. Its industry couldn't sustain prolonged resistance. The math seemed simple. But there was one problem the planners didn't fully account for. Canada had its own plan. Defense Scheme No. 1. Created in 1921 by James Sutherland Brown, Canada's Director of Military Operations. It was every bit as audacious as War Plan Red, and significantly more desperate. Brown's logic was brutal in its clarity. Canada couldn't defend against an American invasion. Not successfully. Not for long. But maybe Canada could delay long enough for Britain to send help. How? By attacking first. The scheme called for preemptive Canadian strikes into the United States. Hit Seattle, Portland, Minneapolis, Albany. Raid into Maine. Cause as much chaos as possible. Destroy infrastructure. Disrupt mobilization. Force American forces to deploy defensively rather than offensively. Then, as American strength gathered, conduct a fighting retreat. Scorched earth. Burn bridges. Destroy roads. Fall back to prepared defensive positions in the Canadian interior. Make every mile cost American lives. Buy time. Hold out. Pray that British reinforcements arrive before it's too late. It was the military equivalent of a Hail Mary pass. Brown knew it. Canadian military leadership knew it. The country had barely enough troops to execute the initial raids, let alone sustain a prolonged conflict. But desperate times breed desperate plans. The darkly comic reality was that both neighbors were planning to invade each other while maintaining perfectly friendly relations at every diplomatic function. Smiling across the border. Shaking hands. Drawing invasion routes on maps in secret. Except none of it happened. The world changed faster than the war plans could adapt. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster granted Canada control over its own foreign policy. The automatic link to British conflicts weakened. Economic integration between the United States and Canada accelerated through the 1930s. The auto industry spread across the border. Resource trade boomed. Investment flowed both directions. The two economies were becoming intertwined in ways that made war economically suicidal. More importantly, real threats emerged that dwarfed old Anglo-American rivalries. 1933, Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany. 1937, Japan invaded China. The world was sliding toward catastrophe, and suddenly the idea of the United States and Britain fighting each other seemed not just unlikely but insane. War Plan Red didn't become obsolete because it was crazy. It became obsolete because the geopolitical landscape shifted beneath it. By 1938, American President Franklin Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King were signing the Ogdensburg Agreement. Permanent Joint Board on Defense. Mutual Defense Commitment. The undefended border would stay undefended because both nations agreed to defend it together. Hitler didn't just threaten the world. He made America and Canada allies in ways that bureaucratic agreements never could. When the bombs started falling in Europe, there was no question which side both nations would take. Together. World War II sealed the transformation. Shared technology. Integrated intelligence. Joint training operations. The Alaska Highway, built in 1942, cut through Canadian territory with full cooperation. Canadian scientists worked on the Manhattan Project. American and Canadian forces fought side by side in Europe and the Pacific. The invasion routes drawn in the 1930s were replaced by supply routes moving troops to fight a common enemy. After the war, NATO brought formal alliance. 1949. Founding members together. The Cold War created the DEW line, the distant early warning system stretching across the Canadian Arctic to detect Soviet bombers. In 1958, NORAD integrated American and Canadian air defense into a single command structure. Soviet missiles aimed at the United States would fly over Canada. Canadian missiles and fighters would help shoot them down. Defending Canada meant defending America. Defending America meant defending Canada. The border became irrelevant in military terms. Today, that border stretches 8891 kilometers. 5,525 miles. The longest undefended border in the world. Families cross for lunch. Trucks haul goods in endless streams. Automated border crossings operate on the honor system in remote areas. The idea of American troops invading Canada seems as ridiculous as science fiction. Two countries that couldn't be more integrated if they tried. But the historical paranoia lingers in subtle ways. Canadian cultural protection policies exist partly from fear of American cultural domination. Economic nationalism movements periodically surge, warning against selling too much to American interests. The joke about Canada becoming the 51st state gets told with nervous laughter, because underneath the humor is ancient anxiety. Polls consistently show Canadians fiercely protective of their independence. The memory of those invasion plans, the attempts that failed, the fear that simmered for generations. It hasn't completely faded. From the American perspective, Canada barely registers as a foreign country. America's attic. Friendly, familiar, mostly forgotten except for hockey and apologies. The asymmetric relationship is stark. The United States accounts for 75% of Canadian trade. Canada accounts for about 15% of American trade. Canada is the 10th largest economy in the world, but it exists in America's economic shadow. The relationship that could have been conquest became something more complicated. Not quite equal partnership. Not quite absorption. Something in between. Recent years have seen the 51st state question resurface in unexpected ways. Political rhetoric, social media memes, trade disputes that hint at deeper resentments. Polling data, when available, shows Americans split or mildly interested in the idea. Canadians remain overwhelmingly opposed. 85% or more reject annexation in any form. The economic realities make the question almost moot. USMCA provides American access to Canadian resources and markets without the political nightmare of actually absorbing 40 million new citizens. Because that's what conquest would mean now. 40 million people, many of them French-speaking, with a parliamentary democracy fundamentally different from the American Republic. A multicultural population with strong ties to Britain and the Commonwealth. Adding that many voters, most of whom lean politically progressive by American standards, would reshape American politics in ways that make the idea unthinkable for large swaths of the political spectrum. International law would render any forcible annexation grounds for global pariah status. Sanctions. Isolation. The destruction of American credibility worldwide. The military cost would be negligible. America could crush Canadian resistance. But the political cost would be civilization ending. The real integration happened quietly, without conquest. Hollywood dominates Canadian screens. American music floods Canadian airwaves. Sports leagues cross the border seamlessly. Corporate ownership blurs national lines. Power grids connect. Pipelines run both directions. Transportation infrastructure treats the border as an inconvenience rather than a barrier. Millions of people have family on both sides. The question isn't whether the countries are integrated. The question is whether it matters that they're technically separate. Why invade when you're already functionally merged? The answer, for almost everything, is you don't. The relationship works. Alliance proved more powerful than conquest. Partnership delivered benefits that occupation never could. War Plan Red sits in archives as a historical curiosity, proof that even the unthinkable gets planned for in Pentagon basements. But there's one exception. One resource that could change the calculation. Water. Canada holds 20% of the world's freshwater. The American Southwest is running dry. Climate change is accelerating. Cities face existential threats. When Phoenix rations water to an hour per day, when Lake Mead hits Deadpool, when 40 million Americans are genuinely thirsty, the old questions might resurface. Not with invasion plans. Not with military force. But with economic pressure. Legal frameworks. Trade agreements. The slow grinding logic of necessity. Friendship lasts until the taps run dry. The alliance that seemed unbreakable might face a test nobody anticipated. Not from hatred or ideology. From simple, desperate need. The document in the archives shows what's possible when necessity overrides common sense. America planned to invade Canada. Failed twice before the planning started. Planned a fourth time anyway. Then discovered something more powerful than conquest. Partnership. Shared interest. Alliance that saved the world when it mattered most. War Plan Red is history. But it's a reminder that alliances aren't guaranteed by geography or culture or even economics. They're chosen. Every single day. By people who decide that cooperation beats domination. That friendship beats fear. That the undefended border stays undefended because both sides want it that way. Stand at that border today and watch the traffic flow. Families. Commerce. Peace. The invasion that never happened created the alliance that changed history. As long as both sides remember that choice, the maps stay in the archives where they belong.